Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. Now in this lecture we continue from where we left in the previous lecture, lecture number 5, where we tried understanding through the dispute on positivism, about positivism, dispute about scientific epistemology, and dispute about nature of social sciences, which was guided largely by the predominant variety of methodological premise, that is positivism. We got a sense of the debate in the previous lecture, which aids in developing a dialectical sociology alongside critical rationalism of Popper. This was more sharply and prominently accomplished later in the same series of dispute. It was accomplished in Habermas, which faced criticism from Albert. This was a criticism about the essentialist nature of dialectic sociology itself. Habermas's dialectical concept of totality against the functionalist concept of system emphasized the need to shift from analytical science to post-Hegelian dialectics. The latter, post-Hegelian dialectics, enables to see the cooperation and the antagonism inherent in the societal totality. This scheme of dialectic unravels the complex nature of societal totality, showing both protagonists and antagonists, and thereby it reaffirmed Adorno's proposition that the scientific problem are not detached from the real life. The totality that comes out of dialectical sociology of the Frankfurt School, through a sustained engagement with philosophical questions in the dispute on positivism, that totality is beyond the pale of positivist comprehension. That is what Adorno and following Adorno, later Habermas and others try to show. Since positivists' scientific pursuit is predominantly guided by scientism, science's belief in itself, it was argued that scientific epistemology and its clone positivism cannot do justice to the complicated nature of totality. As we ended our previous lecture, lecture number 5, with this hint that this all leads us to look at some of the contributions coming from the historians and philosophers of science. Those contributions enhance the scope of the critical debate on science, nature of science, and it also eventually helps us understand as to what kind of twists and turns are expected in the frame of social science. We named 3 who we are looking at more specifically in this lecture: Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, Imre Lakatos. There were others in Anglo-American philosophy who also contributed, but for the sake of convenience we look at these 3 and try to understand as to how science is being revisited. To start with Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn's attempt to unravel the structure of scientific revolution is sharp, rather sharper in fathoming the nature and scope of science. To understand the development the following kind of question would be misleading according to Kuhn. Kuhn is not in favor of the kind of questions we usually hear in day-to-day practices of science. A question such as, when was oxygen discovered? Or what is the relation of Galileo with modern science? According to Kuhn, instead of these questions, the question should be, what was the relation of Galileo and his views with his group? This is an important mischief that Kuhn does with the way we frame questions in textbook science. The question shall be about the relation of the discoveries and inventions with the peers, the experts, the fellow scientists. Relation should highlight this relation. The question should highlight this relation and not just about the cumulative accumulation of information about what was invented, when and how. Kuhn is giving us a point of departure from clean and simple textbook idea of science, where when and how an invention happened becomes too crucial. Instead, he is interested in doing the history of science, where the relation of the scientists, their discovery, their work, their activities with the rest of the community of scientists, that relationship becomes more important in understanding the nature of science. The nature and scope of science is always in relation with set of received beliefs that guide a vast majority of scientists engaged in what Thomas Kuhn calls normal science. The latter, normal science, is the domain of scientific practices characterized by puzzle solving, a kind of troubleshooting. Normal science is essentially about puzzle solving, troubleshooting. Say for example, at the repairing shop, where we take our bicycle to have its handle straightened because bicycle met with some accident and handle got twisted. So, we take it to repairing shop and we try to get it fixed, handle straightened. What do we witness there? We witness the puzzle solving activity of science. It does not amount to a path breaking discovery that could bring about a radical shift or even a benign tremor in the epistemology of science. The day-to-day scientific practices do not bring about any kind of disturbance in the epistemological structure of science. Scientific epistemology remains intact despite all kind of things happening in the name of scientific practices. The puzzle could be same as a problem in science, but, and I quote here Thomas Kuhn, but if it is to classify as a puzzle, a problem must be characterized by more than assured solution. There must also be rules that limit both the nature of acceptable solution and the steps by which they are to be obtained. To solve a jigsaw puzzle is not, for example, merely to make a picture. This is very important because he is trying to state as to how in normal science, in day-to-day science, every problem which is being solved need not be classified as puzzle. It must show more than the assured solution of it, it must show also rules that would be involved in the whole activity of puzzle solving. It is not merely solving a jigsaw puzzle is not merely to make a picture, it is also about following those inherent rules to solve the puzzle and make a picture. And those rules also disclose, are capable of disclosing the limit of both the exercise, the limit of both the nature of acceptable solution and the steps by which they are to be obtained. So, what has Kuhn done by saying this? He has tried to show as to how a scientist solving a puzzle is distinguishable from a child or an artist or someone who does not belong to the community to which the puzzle belongs. There are many of those children who very playfully try to solve puzzles, but their puzzle solving is distinguishable, is not same as a scientist's puzzle solving, because they themselves and their act of puzzle solving are nowhere closer to the community that is indulged in puzzle solving, community of scientists. And hence, Kuhn would emphasize the significance of paradigm that underpins normal science of puzzle solving activities. Unfortunately, Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm has been oversimplified on so many occasions in so many commentaries, and hence one has to understand the complexity Thomas Kuhn adds to the word paradigm. And he says, a paradigm determines the nature of the community, activities, puzzles and solutions. A paradigm is more than just a formula. It entails not only concrete stuff, but a lot of abstract engagement too. It is a misnomer that paradigm is merely a set of rules. It is a misnomer that it is paradigm is equal to set of rules is a misnomer. Following this misnomer, one belongs to a community. Following paradigm, which should not be mistaken for just a set of rules, following that paradigm, one belongs to a community and solves the puzzle acknowledged within that community. Thomas Kuhn dwells upon Michael Polanyi's idea of scientific success related to tacit knowledge acquired through practices, tacit knowledge, knowledge which is not much talked about, knowledge which is not much talked about and is acquired through practices, not through some kind of classroom transaction. Polanyi's idea of scientific success had that inherent subjectivism being disclosed in the body of knowledge, and using that, Thomas Kuhn tries to say that paradigm is like that idea of scientific success. This inarticulate knowledge in the background of most of the scientific activities, this unsaid knowledge enables a scientist to perform something that a philosopher like Wittgenstein put as following: how to apply terms like chair and leaf or game without provoking argument. This is what scientists do. How to apply term like chair and leaf or game without provoking argument. It is a paradigm, Kuhn says, it is the paradigm which may be prior to, more binding and more complete than any set of rules for research that could be unequivocally abstracted from them. One can abstract from a paradigm rules, but paradigm has more components than just rules. A scientist gets the paradigm intuitively and consciously to carry out the puzzle solving in a normal science, with as well as without rules. Mostly and more expectedly with rules, but also without rules they carry out puzzle solving activities, and they are guided by the instructions which are within the paradigm. Kuhn also clears another likely misunderstanding about normal science, which may appear as monolithic unified domain of practice. Normal science, according to Kuhn, is not a monolithic, unified domain. Instead, it is very dynamic and heterogeneous domain. Within normal science, there is little coherence among the practitioners of widely separated field. For example, a chemist and a physicist will give two answers to the same question, to the common question, and the question would be, is a single atom helium a molecule or not? To this single question, the chemist would call it a molecule in answer to the single question, because he or she is looking at it through the kinetic theory of gases. This would be a chemist's answer, because the chemist is looking at the molecule, single atom helium, through kinetic theory of gases. On the other hand, a physicist would not consider it so, because he or she does not find a molecular spectrum coming from a single atom helium. Both, however, engage with the same material, in this example, single atom helium. Through respective training and practices, however, each arrives at a different answer, and hence it is easier to believe that vulnerability of one paradigm need not mean vulnerability of the whole of normal science. Normal science can have more possibility to regenerate itself even though a paradigm turns out to be vulnerable. Furthermore, normal science is by and large cumulative, depending on the acquired body of theory, knowledge, methodology. But this is not correct to imagine that science in general is cumulative. The mistaken idea of cumulative science is, according to Kuhn, entangled with the dominant epistemology that takes knowledge to be a construction placed directly upon raw sense data by the mind. The new science of 17th and 18th century instead dwelt upon the destruction of prior paradigms. The Newtonianism, about which we discussed in first couple of lectures, of the modern science, Newtonianism of the modern science destroyed the tautological scholasticism, the tautological scholasticism that had come from the Greek, that was destroyed by the Newtonianism of the modern science. Likewise, there was supermechanical aspect of Newtonianism. Kuhn puts it in this way, supermechanical aspect of Newtonianism, which caused a blinder about the property of gravity among other limitations. It began to change as Einstein developed theory of relativity and science moved beyond the century-old regime of Newtonianism. The sharp rupture between the old and new paradigms and practices underline the non-cumulative character of science. This is very profound contribution that Kuhn makes. Unlike the textbook idea of science being cumulative exercise, Kuhn is trying to show that science is also non-cumulative in character. Thus, there are two levels of competition and conflict of paradigms. One is across time, which amounts to the replacement of old with the new. However, it involves great deal of dramatic conflicting and churning at the level of community of scientists. That is first. The second is, as mentioned earlier, between the paradigms within normal science at any point of time, which appear like rivaling political choices in a truly democratic society. Lastly, it is important to remember that Kuhn reaffirms throughout the discussion on the nature and scope of paradigm. And what does it reaffirm? That it does not only entail cognitive, but also normative function. That normative function are equally important component of a paradigm. They also make a paradigm larger than life. It enables scientists to do both, following as well as map making, following the paradigm as well as map making in the light of the paradigm. The categories of theories, method, standard, quality, rigor and directions, all of these and many more acquire normative character in a paradigm. And something with normative character would be constraining, binding, forceful to regulate a scientific practice. All these aspects of a paradigm are marshalled to determine legitimacy or illegitimacy of a problem, question and investigation, and consequently even solution. Hence, with the change of paradigm, there are usually significant shifts in the criteria determining the legitimacy both of problem and proposed solution, according to Thomas Kuhn. In continuity with what Thomas Kuhn has to offer, one understands that there is a possibility to liberate the idea of science and scientific way of seeing from positivistic rejection of the presence of theory. I mean, Vienna Circle's logical positivism rejects the presence of theory in last analysis. Classical sociologists try to, within positivistic framework, try to bring in, smuggle in theoretical conceptual engagement. Kuhn begins to show, with Kuhn one begins to see that within science and within positivism informed by scientific epistemology, one can see the presence of theory. One can also get to see a priori of science. In response to Karl Popper's allegedly incomplete break from positivism, Thomas Kuhn sought to show the roles of theories, methods, paradigms and a subjective realm of practices in the community of scientists in history of science. In normal science, it is not correspondence theory of truth in which facts would be everything and facts would be allowed to speak for itself as it appeared in positivism. Rather than correspondence, Thomas Kuhn highlights consensus among the practitioners, consensus as a cardinal feature of paradigm that matters most in the normal science. In the face of the predominant role of intersubjective consensus, consensus would be intersubjective in nature, and in that kind of situation of intersubjective consensus of the scientists, neither positivism nor Karl Popper's quasi-positivism can stand. Yes, in Kuhn's analysis, Popper's critical rationalism turns out to be a quasi-positivism. It is a return, some sort of return to positivism with due self-criticality of science that Popper had offered, and that is what Kuhn tried to expose. Perhaps this was more systematic and stinging exposure that Kuhn gave us. Moving ahead, we look at Feyerabend and Lakatos. They both add two different and significant aspects to the idea of science and scientific way of seeing. Though different, both however have explicit affinity in many regards. Feyerabend and Lakatos tend to depart from Thomas Kuhn, and they both tend to arrive at two different destinations. Lakatos arrives at scientific research program, quote unquote, and Feyerabend to anarchy in science. Notwithstanding the different destinations, the two, Feyerabend and Lakatos, shared a common concern. Firstly, Karl Popper's falsification is naive and it makes no difference to the critical understanding of science. Secondly, Kuhn's proposition of normal science and scientific revolution only distract from understanding the real face of science. They are targeting both Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. As obvious, the two, Lakatos and Feyerabend, engaged in some sort of dispute with both Popper and Kuhn. Lakatos is unsparing in criticizing Thomas Kuhn for perpetuating what Lakatos considers psychologistic rather than logical structure of science. With the terms such as crisis and paradigm, according to Lakatos, Thomas Kuhn has only created some kind of psychological humbug. There is no logical structure of science coming out of Thomas Kuhn's discussion on scientific revolution. Lakatos informs us about how to get critical about otherwise so revolutionary thesis of Thomas Kuhn. There is seldom a logical way to judge the incommensurability of new and old paradigms. According to Lakatos, there is no such logical way to judge this incommensurability of the new, the rivaling and old, the status quoist paradigms. Nor is it possible to detect the causes of the crisis, which is very central to the framework of scientific revolution according to Thomas Kuhn. One does not get to understand the details of the causes behind those crises. The problem is even graver when one thinks of the monopoly of normal science that dominates Kuhn's analysis. There is not one theory, there are many, and they tend to exist in competition. With this recognition that there is a pluralism of theory, and this pluralism is not peaceful, there is bitter competition amongst these theories. And in that kind of situation, Lakatos emphasizes succession of theories and not one theory by another. It is a succession of theory which constitute a scientific research program. The latter scientific research program is a manifestation of a remarkable continuity of various theories weld together, put together, various theories coming together, and that coming together of various theories actually constitute what Lakatos calls a scientific research program. And finally, the history of science is a history of competing research programs, which means variety of theories have been welded together and they are all competing with one another. And that is what he says, that the history of science is, if it is read from the perspective of Lakatos, is actually a history of competing research programs. Lakatos deems it necessary to have competition of research program for the progress in science. If you want to see the progress in science that we have envisaged in very idealistic mode, one has to encourage the competition of research program, which would also mean competition of theories put together, theories which come from past and which have been revisited at present. They put together, creating variety of research programs, and those research programs come in competition. That is the most promising scenario in history of science, and that scenario augurs well for progress in science. While Paul Feyerabend is in debate with Lakatos, with ample disagreements and also equally abundant compliments for each other, Feyerabend is primarily responding to Popper and Kuhn. He grounds his discussion in history and philosophy of science and finds support in avant-garde movement in art. There was something called avant-garde movement in art, and that avant-garde movement ensured subversion of predominant modernist way of looking at art. The modern abstractions that had influenced art for century was being subverted in avant-garde movement in art. Among various variants, diverse variants of avant-garde movement in art, there was one which was called Dadaism. Dadaism, as a variety of avant-garde movement in art, sought for freedom from the fixed formulaic way of doing modern art, to put it very briefly. Feyerabend was aware of the limits of political ideology, of anarchism. He understood that as a political ideology, anarchism does not go very far. It does not really fulfill the function of political nature, socio-political nature. So, he was aware of the limits of the anarchism, ideology of anarchism, and he also was aware of the allegations of indifference in the Dadaist idea of anything goes. The avant-garde movement in art, Dadaism, was known for its advocacy summed up in this one adage, anything goes. Feyerabend knew the limits of anarchism and Dadaist idea of anything goes. However, Feyerabend's intention was to utilize the emancipatory value of anarchism and passion in order to understand science. Pretty innovative. In the history of science, Feyerabend's approach therefore acquires an enchanting value in the sense that it plays with possibilities, unlike many of the philosophers and historians of science who did not look beyond science to understand the nature of science. Paul Feyerabend is truly feeding himself on variety of materials which are beyond the pale of science, yet they inform Feyerabend to understand the nature of science. Willing to be recognized as a flippant Dadaist, an incoherent follower of Dadaist, he was ready to risk and be recognized as a flippant occasional Dadaist, but not a serious anarchist. He did not want to be called a serious anarchist. Feyerabend articulated his objective in one of his letters. And what does he say in the letter? I want you to sense chaos where at first you noticed an orderly arrangement of well-behaved things and processes. Everywhere we see order, Feyerabend would want us to see disorder. For him, disorder is not an a binary opposite which would exist elsewhere and order would exist separately. They coexist. This is indeed to show a rupture in science, unlike Kuhn's idea of normal science, which shows if Kuhn's idea emphasize the closing of mind in the consensus amongst the community of scientists, Paul Feyerabend is trying to utilize this rupture in science to show the possibility that scientists also have great deal of possibilities. Also, making it a more nuanced than the misleading terms such as anarchism and Dadaism may connote. Unlike the connotations, negative connotations of the term anarchism and Dadaism, Feyerabend reminds that his theses are not anti-science. His famous work, beautifully written essays in that book against method, therefore, is not against science. Feyerabend is, and I quote, against ideologies that use the name of science for cultural murder. Very strong words, but very passionately articulated. He is not against science. His work under the title Against Method is not against science. It is against ideologies that use the name of science for cultural murder, which means removing all the possibilities of cultural interference in science, or being able to see as a scientist all kind of cultural interplay that happens in the realm of science. And meanwhile, it is also to steer clear of the confusions created by the immediate predecessors such as Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. Popper began with an anti-method stance and allegedly deceitfully brought method back, while Kuhn lost in the useless terminologies such as paradigm, revolution, normal science, puzzle solving, etc. Popper did a deceitful act and Kuhn was lost in the world of his charming terminologies. Neither of them create the possibility to rethink science, which could accommodate pluralism of the way of seeing, diversity of being scientific, pluralism of methodological forays. It is in that kind of situation that Feyerabend becomes important. Why? Because first of all, Feyerabend clears the superiority of rationalism that seemed original of Popper. The humanitarian face of Popper's critical rationalism was specialized, formalistic and elitist, as Feyerabend notes in a half-page long footnote. It was a pale reflection of Mill, J.S. Mill. Revisiting J.S. Mill's On Liberty, the text, Feyerabend seeks to show that alternative arguments, that empirical details, the empirical details necessary for falsifying process, and in agreement with Lakatos, Feyerabend persuades that these alternatives are not merely catalysts which can later be removed in the rational reconstruction. Then what are these alternatives? What are these alternatives that is being referred to? To fathom them, to fathom those alternatives, Feyerabend takes an anthropological turn with Lévi-Strauss, one of the French anthropologists accredited to have popularized structuralism. Feyerabend takes that anthropological turn with Lévi-Strauss to understand the significance of the primitive worldview as well as hermetic writings during the Renaissance. This is another innovative play with the possibility that Feyerabend performs. This anthropological turn enables him to combat the triumph of scientific chauvinism. He says, and I quote, "What is compatible with science should live. What is not compatible with science should die." This is what science has been doing. To arrive at this idea, very critical idea, a kind of allegation toward rescuing metaphysical as well as theoretical pluralism, Feyerabend elaborates a few theses. This begins with the proposition of anarchism as a remedy for epistemology and philosophy of science. Once again, taking another turn, he says, engaging with Lenin and Einstein at once, he says, as with Lenin and Einstein, as in politics and science respectively, adherence to one epistemology is an anathema, is an undesirable thing. Rule of one epistemology, control of one epistemology is something undesirable within science. A seeker of political transformation, such as Lenin, and a seeker of scientific advancement, such as Einstein, would instead appear to be unscrupulous opportunist, and there is no harm in appearing unscrupulous opportunist. To the and who would call them unscrupulous opportunists? Those who are systematic epistemologists. Systematic epistemologists do not expect this kind of flexibility coming from the seeker of transformation in the realm of politics or the seeker of advancement in the realm of science. Be it the invention of atomism, the Copernican revolution, the rise of modern atomism, kinetic theory, dispersion theory, stereochemistry, quantum theory, wave theory of light, they all, Feyerabend would try to show, they all happened because the thinkers behind them decided not to be guided by certain obvious methodological rules. This is a very powerful statement. They decided not to be guided by certain obvious methodological rules, and therefore, they could arrive at some of those theoretical sophistications. In another long footnote, Feyerabend discusses the example of Niels Bohr, the physicist Niels Bohr, who never deemed a finished work as a conclusion. Bohr defied the logic of scientism by dismissing simplicity, by dismissing elegance or even consistency in the process of his works. And Feyerabend thus suggests, and I quote, logically perfect versions, if such versions exist, logically perfect versions usually arrive only long after the imperfect versions have enriched science by their contributions. It is a beautiful suggestion he is offering. I reiterate, logically perfect versions, if such versions exist, usually arrive only long after the imperfect versions have enriched science by their contributions. It is the principle of anything goes, which is italicized by Feyerabend throughout the text. It is the principle of anything goes that comes to aid a scientist in relating idea and action, construction and destruction in a playful activity of passion. The whole gamut of scientific practices thereby becomes, for Feyerabend, looking at history of science, he would say the whole gamut is playful activity of passion. This leads to understand counter rule, quote unquote, behind scientific way of seeing, being and doing, unlike the rules that many epistemologists of science were interested in, which did not incorporate counter rule, it only incorporated rules. Feyerabend is saying that history of science shows the presence and importance of counter rule. The counter rule instructs to proceed counter inductively. Counter rule allows one to play with the possibility of counter inductivity. It allows to play with hypotheses which are inconsistent with the established theories, and this is what counter inductivity means. This is what counter rule means. A scientist capable of operating with hypotheses which are inconsistent with the established theories, rather than scientific epistemology which advocated the complete consistency between questions, theories, solutions, etc., etc. Thereby, Feyerabend becomes distinguishable from both Popper and Kuhn. His stance of counter rule and thereof advocacy of counter inductive investigation emphasizes that thinking of alternative in the aftermath of refutation, which was promoted by Karl Popper, thinking of alternative after refutation is done, or destruction of orthodox theory is done. After all these destructions are done, if we are trying to look for alternative, then we are just putting the cart before the horse. The alternatives have to be envisaged, thought of, explored at the onset of exploration. Right in the beginning, the ideas of alternatives have to come to our attention, and thereby they are supposed to lead to pluralistic methodology. The horse of thoughts and epistemology, they are many and they are unruly, and they are necessary precondition in Feyerabend's imagination of science. Very aptly he puts, and I quote, "We need a dream world in order to discover the features of the real world we think we inhabit. We need a dream world in order to discover the features of the real world we think we inhabit, and which may actually be just another dream world. We must invent a new conceptual system that suspends or clashes with the most carefully established observational results, which confounds the most plausible theoretical principles and introduces perceptions that cannot become part of the existential perceptual world." This is evidently Feyerabend's departure from Thomas Kuhn, who show the emergence of alternative, the new, only after the prolonged and sustained failure of the normal science. What Kuhn tries to show at the end of normal science, Feyerabend brings it before normal science and says that from this kind of practice, where alternatives are very clear, where pluralistic methodology is guiding us, from there science should begin. The counter rule would instead suggest that anything scientific starts with the alternative ideas at play, and hence, despite the relative autonomy of fact as propounded by positivists and also post-positivists, Feyerabend underlines the intimate relations of fact with theory. We choose facts, describe and understand them in accordance with some or other theory. Hence, the presence of alternative theoretical conceptual apparatus is crucial precondition. Being realistic, however, Feyerabend agrees with J.S. Mill in admitting that revolutionary ideas eventually transform into obstacles to thought, and this is in accordance with what J.S. Mill had suggested. This is Feyerabend's rider, a caveat that he adds, and I quote this caveat from Feyerabend: alternatives are still employed, but they are no longer contain realistic counter proposals. They only serve as a background for the splendor of the new theory. So, therefore, such alternatives do not hold any kind of significance. That possibility also exists, that alternatives themselves would become too ritualized and they would be employed only for adding splendor of the new theory. This is so due to the predominant view in scientific epistemology, from Francis Bacon to Thomas Kuhn, to cleanse science of the inconsistent materials. They all prepare us to arrive at unanimity of opinion, much like that of the rigid church. We have understood as to how Thomas Kuhn, Feyerabend, Lakatos engage with one another, and they also engage with Karl Popper, who was in the center of the positivist dispute. This revisiting of science also enables us to interpretatively find a linkage. As one of the consequences of the dispute on positivism, one interpretative linkage with the rise of a methodological anti-foundationalism in social sciences. In the light of the critical debates on science, nature of science that we have heard, with reference to Karl Popper, positivism debate in German sociology, with Adorno, Horkheimer playing important role, and then coming to some of the historians of science, Thomas Kuhn, Lakatos and Feyerabend, we begin to ask as to how this all impacts methodology in social science, and in that regard we grapple with a methodological stance which is famously called anti-foundationalism in social sciences. According to Susan Heckman, the early stage of sociology of knowledge deemed it necessary to get rid of idols, phantoms and prejudices in objective social sciences. It was in the light of the foundation of thoughts emerging from the Enlightenment, and we have heard on this in previous lectures in more detail. With the interventions of Heidegger, philosophers like Heidegger, Wittgenstein and lately Richard Rorty, it is important to think of rejecting the foundational thoughts. These are the ideas coming from Susan Heckman, who engages with the bodies of philosophy and proposes a possibility of rejecting foundational thoughts being thoughts emerging from the Enlightenment, critical rationalism, rationalist philosophy and thereof scientific epistemology. This rejection is not merely about a post-positivist advance. Instead, it holds to be an anti-positivist stance that seeks to change the vocabulary altogether. It seeks to transform the grammar of seeing and being seen dramatically different. Heckman notes, and I quote, "What the anti-foundational philosophers suggest is not a search for truth conceived apart from history and culture, but rather an examination of the relationship between human thought and human existence. The kind of sociology of knowledge that can be found in the works of Wittgenstein, Heidegger and Gadamer offers an understanding of what the social sciences are about and definitely rejects the Enlightenment conception of knowledge." Quote ends. This perspective benefits from sociology of knowledge. Karl Mannheim conceived sociology of knowledge as a branch of sociology which seeks to analyze the relationship between knowledge and existence, social conditioning of knowledge, and it draws them into the horizon of sciences. It is furthermore to show that knowledge of society as well as sociology of knowledge maintains a dual composition. Knowledge entails ideology that is more inclined to maintain status quo relate to a particular ideology and competing with other ideologies. Secondly, there is another aspect of knowledge, and that is utopia. Utopia, a transcendental component inclined to threaten the ideologically sustained status quo. Mannheim imagines an inevitable presence of utopias, utopias which are reality transcending device in the social framework of knowledge. And in a worst case, the complete elimination of reality transcending elements from our world would lead us to a matter of factness, which ultimately would mean the decay of the human will. Sociology of knowledge clarifies that relationism, there is supposed to be relationism in our approach to knowledge, and relationism here signifies merely that all of the elements of meaning in a given situation have reference to one another and derive their significance from this reciprocal interrelationship in a given framework of thought. Heckman's quest of anti-foundational thought, with a comparative reading of Mannheim and a hermeneutist like Hans Gadamer, Sociology of Knowledge and Hermeneutics together, this comparative reading informs Heckman's quest of anti-foundational thoughts. And her complaint is that Mannheim is not sufficiently departing from the foundation. Instead, Mannheim falls short of really dismissing the foundation given by the Enlightenment. If at all, Mannheim also slips into some kind of subjective reasoning, and that is why the criticism that Mannheim is keen about developing methodology that can be conducive for a somewhat anti-foundational sociology of knowledge. He is keen, Mannheim is keen about developing something which can fit somewhere if we look interpretatively in anti-foundational sociology of knowledge, but then it turns on its back and it does not satisfy the kind of anti-foundationalism which Heckman is looking for. And therefore, she finds that Heidegger, Wittgenstein and Richard Rorty are more crucial in understanding anti-foundationalism. This is one way in which we can understand as to how social science starts responding to this new kind of situation in which revisiting are taking place. Another is feminist standpoint theory, feminist epistemology, which also tries to think of successor science, a different kind of science which can be suitable for understanding women's issues. This whole discussion actually invite us to take a post-positivist turn, or to try to locate post-positivist turn by looking at some of the theoretical methodological discussions in social sciences. That relooking would be in a way in negotiation as well as departure from the classical sociology. In many ways, we will be returning to some of the questions, methodological questions set by classical sociology. With this, we end this lecture here, and we will go to discuss those methodological contributions in social sciences in the next lecture. Thank you.